Just a reminder to our Speculating Wildly About Crime listeners, this is for entertainment purposes only and solely the thoughts and opinions of our team. We do invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Welcome to Speculating Wildly About Crime. I will be your host, Dana, tonight. We have a case that takes place in 1974. Let's get into it. So we're going to be talking about Mary and Susie Reker. Mary and Susie were sisters. They were 2 of 6 kids in this family. Their parents were Fred and Rita Reker, and they lived in St. Cloud, Minnesota. For those who don't know where St. Cloud, Minnesota is, it's roughly an hour north of the Twin Cities. So let's go back to 1974. Mary was the older sister, and she's 15, and Susie is 12 when this story takes place. It was a Labor Day weekend, which is September 2nd, 1974, and it was the day before Mary was set to start school. She went to school in a town called Little Falls, Minnesota, which is about 45 minutes further north. Mary needed to go to the store to get some school supplies and a winter jacket before going off to school. Rita, her mom, thought it wasn't a good idea. Mary had just gone school supplies shopping a few days prior, and they had house chores to do before she would leave for school. She did stay in Little Falls during the week, and then she would often come home on the weekends. And I did want to mention that a bulk of the information I found on this case did come from a podcast called The Deck, which is hosted by Ashley Flowers. But otherwise, a lot of the news sources did come from local sources like Fox 9 News out of Minneapolis and so on. I've got those linked in the show notes. Mary, the older sister, insisted she had to go school shopping that day. She wanted to go, she had to go. But Susie, the younger sister, wanted to tag along. And so finally, Rita, their mom, said, all right, go ahead. And they had left the house around 11 a.m. So the day goes on, they're doing house chores, and Rita gets a phone call from the carpool group that Mary was set to leave with that day to go to school. And they said they needed to push the time that they were leaving back to 7 p.m. Rita thinks, great, that gives us more time to do stuff around the house and pack and whatnot. She loses track of time, and by 3 p.m., she notices that the girls still aren't back yet, but she puts it out of her mind and keeps going about her day. By 5 p.m., the family and Rita were very worried about why the girls still weren't home yet. So they'd been gone for about 6-ish hours by that point. They called around to neighbors to see if anybody had seen the girls recently, and nobody had. Fred, the father, and the oldest son, they go to the police to report the girls missing. The police promptly told them the girls were runaways. By 10 p.m., a neighbor came by and said he couldn't sleep very well, so he would drive around with the family to search around neighborhoods for the girls.
It's a neighbor that hangs out with them on a regular, or is it just, hey, I can't sleep, and so do y'all need help with something?
It sounds like a mix of both. St. Cloud isn't that big of a town. So in 1974 especially, I could see if you're calling around to the neighbors to see if they'd seen the girls and they still haven't come around, I could see a neighbor being like, I can't sleep. I can help drive around with you guys and see if we can find him somewhere.
Because it immediately gave me like abducted in plain sight vibes.
Very true. That night, they weren't able to find the girls. So the next morning, the police was willing to put out the girls' information to other departments in case they had come across the girls. Now, in the Deck podcast, they were able to interview Rita, and she made a point in that podcast to talk about how back then it wasn't as easy as just reporting the girls missing, because the police questioned if the family even had those 2 girls as daughters, if they even existed. So while they did provide information to other departments, they still did everything they could to write off the family's concerns. As time goes on, they spoke to a bus ticketing person And they showed a picture of the girls or gave a description of the girls. And he said that, yes, he had sold the girls bus tickets to Little Falls. But at this point, the police said, well, there you go. They're runaways. Fast forward 26 days, and the family's pastor knocked on their door to tell them that Susie had been found dead. Susie was found just outside of St. Cloud at a quarry nearby. Two teenage boys who had been exploring around the quarry had found Susie's body. She was found in the same clothes that she had gone missing in, so the same clothes that she was wearing when she went off shopping with her older sister Mary. As they were examining the area, they had found clothing scattered on the way down to the water. It looked like if somebody took a ball of clothes and threw it over the side of this quarry. Mary was found 40 feet underwater in the quarry. Susie was stabbed 13 times, and her sister Mary was stabbed 6 times, and she had no clothes on. Before I go on, I want to show a picture of what some of these quarries look like, because it might be hard to visualize without seeing it. So this is a picture from the 1974 articles of what these quarries look like. So as you can see, there's a very steep drop off, and you can see where clothes might have gotten stuck on some ledges.
Mhm.
And I'll show you a picture of kind of what they look like in more recent years. So again, not as quite as steep as the last picture, but a pretty steep drop off. And since they are old, like mining quarries, that's why the water was so deep. So they were found 26 days after they had been reported missing, but the water in the quarry was very cold, and it was able to preserve Mary's body more than her sister's. Also, Mary had been wearing a watch, and she was found wearing the watch, which was stopped at 3:25. That could be nothing, or it could be something. I think that's what you'll find a lot in this case, but I did think it was interesting that the watch was stopped at 3:25.
So since her body was preserved, were they able to know time or date of death by decomposition, or because it wasn't decomposed, they couldn't? Maybe they did that with Susie's body?
I did not see anything about actual time of death. The best that they could come up with was that they were killed or died the same day they went missing, because the younger sister, Susie, was found in the same clothing that she had gone missing in. However, this case has a startling lack of evidence in it. For example, say that the girls were not sexually assaulted, but there's technically no evidence to say if they were sexually assaulted either. So there's no way to say yes or no.
I'm trying to think. 1974, where were we with DNA testing? And
Very limited, I would say.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, fingerprints, sure. Or they could collect things.
1974 time could also play a factor in collecting body evidence for time of death and things like that too, right?
I would think so, but they didn't have the technology we have at all.
They didn't have a lot of evidence. An additional problem to a lot of the evidentiary issues was compounded by jurisdictional problems. They went missing in St. Cloud. That's where they lived, but they were found in Waite Park. You can't really tell the difference of when you're in St. Cloud and when you're in Waite Park, because the only way you can tell is the sign on the side of the road that says Waite Park. Was it the Stearns County Sheriff or the St. Cloud Police Chief? There were some problems with that. So not only were there jurisdictional problems, but the sheriff at the time was in the hospital with a cancer diagnosis. He was dealing with some personal issues, and the police chief was in the process of leaving the department. And this particular day, he was away doing some training. We have 2 murdered girls, and the top ranking people weren't there. And I also wanted to acknowledge that this was an election year for the county sheriff's department. Ashley Flowers made a point of saying this, but During those days, the county sheriff, when they got elected, cleaned house and then made sure their buddies had a job. So that's a bulk of what happened. We'll name some persons of interest, but to this day, nobody's ever been arrested for the murder of these two young women.
How far were they found from the place they were going to go shopping?
Miles.
Okay.
So really not very far.
So they could have potentially walked themselves there. It wasn't miles. That would be a ridiculous amount of traveling for two teenagers that would have energy.
That's correct. Some additional information that can help piece together what happened. So Mary had spent a lot of time at her grandparents' house over the summer, and Rita, her mom, noticed that something was up with Mary in the days before her disappearance, and she asked what was going on, but Mary did not share what was bothering her with her mom. However, other people, like friends, have also said that something was clearly bothering Mary, and she might have tried to talk to some of her friends. One friend said, I don't know, maybe she was trying to say something, but I was thinking about something else. I wasn't really listening. There was definitely something on Mary's mind. And to reinforce this is after the sister's death, in Mary's diary, there was a peculiar entry, and the mom, Rita, summarized it, and in portion it reads, quote, "If I am murdered, find my killer. See that justice wins over. I have few reasons to fear for my life, and what I ask is important." And she also, in this diary entry, bequeathed her stuffed animals to her sisters, should she go missing.
How do you not say that to anybody? Your sister, any of your other siblings, your parents, your friend, that never comes up. I tell you everything that's on my mind and everything that's going on in my life.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like from what Rita was saying is she had tried to ask what's going on, but Mary didn't want to tell her. But Mary potentially tried to tell some friends, but they weren't paying attention, had their own stuff going on. On the day that the girls went missing, there were sightings of them. So earlier in the day, the girls had been at Shopko.
Is it like a Walmart?
I would say it's like a smaller Walmart. They had been seen at Shopko, and then they had left Shopko to go to a store called Zayre's from roughly 1 to 2:30ish. Now, this Zayre's is described as like a Walmart, a Target, so a store that's got the multiple departments in it.
And forgive me, Dana, are these stores, are they like in like a shopping center?
Yes, so that's what one of the next points is this Zayre's is in a shopping center.
How do they get to their house to these shopping centers? Was that a bus ride? Did they have a friend drop them off? Because they were not driving at the time, right?
They walked.
Oh, so this shopping center is close enough for them to
Walk. Correct. When they were at this Zayre's, they were near the food court, and a neighbor had seen the girls in the store. After the neighbor and the girls exchanged their pleasantries, both Susie and Mary kind of walked off, and they went towards the grocery section. So the neighbor, as the girls were starting to walk off, they heard Susie, the younger sister, say something to the effect of, "I don't want to go with that man. I don't like him." It's not an exact quote. He doesn't remember exactly what the girls say, but that was the sentiment of it. So the neighbor was like, that's weird. And then he checks out and he goes out to his car and he sees an odd looking man in the parking lot, just standing by his car, people watching. And he got a weird feeling about it. So he sat in his car for a while and was going to wait for the girls to come out of the store so we could see them go off. However, after a while, the girls hadn't come out, so I'm probably just overreacting, and then he leaves. There were other people that did say they saw an odd man by a car as well.
Was this a neighbor that heard Susie say this, waited out to see if they made it out of the store? Is it the same neighbor that could not sleep and drove the family around?
That's not ever been disclosed if it was.
I think I found my suspect. Keep going.
So after the girls were found, tips start coming in, of course. And one tip that came in was from a man who said that around 2 p.m. he was at a local bar not far from the store, and he saw a group of people come in. With the group of people, there was mainly teens and an older man. However, the older man was probably closer to his late 20s, but when you're with a group of teens, you seem older, right? The guy sees the older guy order a drink, and he's talking to one of the teen girls who he believes to be Mary Reker. And the police say, "How did you know? You've never met this girl. How could you know it's her?" And he says it was her because the girl he was talking to had an army jacket on with the last name Riker on it. And that was the jacket Mary was wearing that day. A pretty solid tip, in my personal opinion. And he said the girl in the jacket was having fun, but the other was not. He went back to his drink, and the next time he looked around and did like a poll of the bar, that group was gone. Police don't believe this tip because the guy at the bar had never met Mary or Susie before, and no one else at the bar confirmed that they saw these two girls or this man. So this tip just fell dead.
Did the police do a thorough enough investigation where they interviewed the bartender or other patrons that were there?
The most that I could find was that nobody else could confirm it. To me, that reads that they did ask around, but the bartender didn't confirm it. Other patrons didn't confirm it.
But he knew identifying factors that were fitting, right?
He could, he could identify the jacket with the specific last name, but I also don't know exactly when this tip came in. So I don't know if it was after it was publicized about the girls and what they were wearing. To talk about one of the people of interest, actually all of the people of interest, I have to give you some other stories. The next story I want to tell you is of Sue Dukowitz. She was working at the counter of her family convenience store in St. Cloud. This happened in 1976, so 2 years later. She's 14 years old, and she's robbed at gunpoint by two teenage boys. They took some money out of the register, and they had her leave with them in their car. She was bound and went to a nearby town to a gravel pit where they did sexually assault her. They then pulled her out of the car and started to stab her. She was able to escape the assault by pretending to be dead. The two teenage boys left. She was able to get up and walk towards some residential lights nearby. That family let her in, let her lay on the couch, and they called for help. And in the meantime, while this is happening, her family did report her missing. And once they found her, Sue gave a description of the people who took her. The police later found the boys, and their names were Herb Notch and James Wagner. They were arrested, and the investigators did notice similarities of the cases and looked into these two boys, into the relation to the Reker sisters' murders. So Wagner moved to St. Cloud after the girls were killed, so he was pretty much written off. But Herb Notch was local to the area. He was from Luxembourg, which is a small town just right outside of St. Cloud. Because Notch was considered a person of interest, they did polygraph him at the time. It was announced that he had passed, but later they determined that the screening was actually inconclusive, but he had been forgotten as a suspect. So, to give even more background on Notch, he was 17 at the time of Sue Dukowitz's assaults and attempted murder. But in 1974, the same year that Mary and Susie were killed, Notch and another man named Russ Platts both worked at the same job. They worked at a grocery store called Zehrs. That is the same store Mary and Susie were last seen at.
There's only one Zehrs in the area, or that was confirmed to be the same store.
Correct.
Okay.
Platts, the other boy, had said he had always had a suspicion that Notch was involved because Notch would often play with a knife and he would sit in the Zayre's parking lot on his days off and people watch. One day they were hanging out together and Platts asked Notch if he knew about the girls or had any involvement with the girls, to which Notch just hissed like a snake. So Platts did notify police of his feelings and of this encounter, but nothing really came of it at the time, and he was not polygraphed until 2 years later after the Sue Dukowitz assault. Throughout his life, he had been accused of attacking 2 other women in the 80s and 90s, but there's never any physical evidence connecting Notch. In 2017, Notch is 58 years old and he is dying of liver failure in a St. Cloud hospital. Rita, the mother, had always felt like they'd get a deathbed confession from whoever the killer was. So when he was in the hospital, Rita decided she wanted to confront him. So she actually recorded the confrontation. However, he denied any involvement and said something to the effect of, "I'm going to hell." So not necessarily a confession, but definitely acknowledging he had done wrong in his life, that he would go to hell. He ended up dying a week later after Rita had confronted him. Again, he was never arrested in connection with the Reker sisters' murders. That's the end of the person of interest story with Herb Notch. Now I want to tell you another story of another young woman named Georgianne Dreher. Back in 1974, she was new to St. Cloud and also a teen girl, so she was looking for friends. And one day she was in the parking lot of the Zayre's shopping center and she was approached by another teen boy. It was really hot and she asked if he knew of any places nearby to swim, and he recommended the quarries. Just to pause here for a second, the quarries, even to this day, are a very popular swimming area. So for him to recommend swimming at the quarries isn't necessarily a red flag. Georgianne decides, great, new friends, that's what I'm here to do. So the two rode their bike off together and went to a nearby river. They were talking as they were riding their bikes, and he said his name was Lloyd, and he was a traveling carnival worker. As they're going along, he pulls a knife on Georgianne. He proceeds to assault her, and he tells her about a fantasy that he has. Sisters. So during the assault, a car had pulled up near them, and he got distracted / startled, and Georgianne was able to escape. And she happened to be assaulted less than 3 miles from where Mary and Susie were found at the quarry. So Georgianne reports the assault to the police, and the sheriff at the time felt there was no connection to Mary and Susie whatsoever. Many years later, Georgianne had a Google alert set up for the name Lloyd and Carnival Worker. So in 2014, she gets a notification that says Lloyd Welch, a one-time traveling carnival worker, had been named a person of interest in another notorious cold case involving young girls' sisters. The sisters were the Lyon sisters, Sheila, 12, and Catherine, 10. They disappeared from the Wheaton Plaza shopping center just outside of Washington, D.C., March of 1975. I know in the deck coverage, Ashley Flowers mentioned that Crime Junkie did do an in-depth coverage of the case, so that would be definitely something to listen to. But as she said in the deck coverage, it's a very brutal case. But the sisters were murdered. As a part of the investigation, authorities in Maryland released a mugshot of what Lloyd Welch looked like in 1977. As Georgianne is looking at the Google alert, she sees the mugshot and realizes that's the man who had assaulted her. But Georgianne reached out to investigators on the East Coast that were investigating the Lyon sisters' murders. She had enough information that the 2 lead investigators actually came to St. Cloud, Minnesota to interview her in person. So they took her account very seriously. Georgianne was able to recall details like Lloyd's girlfriend's name back in 1975, when they had been riding their bikes together, he had mentioned that his girlfriend's name was Helen, and he was dating a woman named Helen that was traveling carnival with him.
Do we know if Lloyd was from this town? Because if he was a traveling carnivalist, then was that happening every time there was a carnival in town? Or was he from here and it was happening when he was not traveling to carnivals? Do we know the carnival schedule?
I am not aware of the carnival schedule. However, this was Labor Day weekend.
So there's probably a carnival there. But then to David's point, were there other murders like across the country that were similar to this, where he may have traveled, or if he was just maybe in a tri-state area or whatever, right?
Potentially, because the Lyon sisters were not long after the Reker sisters were murdered.
I'm curious to know the carnival schedule and his schedule and the death schedule. You know what I mean? But so I'm assuming like what, 16, 17, 18, 19 years old, and your job is to travel with carnivals. That would be a great alibi, right? You're in and out of cities.
Yeah. And Georgianne was subpoenaed for her testimony in connection with the Lyon sisters' murders. However, they ended up not using her testimony. He was convicted for the Lyon sisters' murders, and Stearns County in Minnesota still do not believe Lloyd to be a suspect in the Reker sisters case.
Dana, what year was he found guilty for the Lyon sisters? Because that had to be a huge span if they were Google alerts.
In 2014 is when she got the Google alert. He was indicted for their murders July 2015. He pled guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder in September 2017.
So to me, it would seem like each case, there's a different kind of progression to it, right? Which happens with a lot of killers. You start out small, here's the query, but then you get that urge, you become invincible when you don't get caught.
I could see that happening. The other question that I had is, how many carnivals did he go to in St. Cloud? Because he's originally from Appalachia. He's not from St. Cloud. So he had to have some sort of knowledge that the quarries were there and it's a popular swimming area.
Obviously, he was on trial or something with these Lyon girl murders.
He did plead guilty to the 2 charges, so there wouldn't have been a trial necessarily. He was never tied in with this case other than being a person of interest for a minute. But another person that came across the police's plate as a potential suspect was in 1978, Michael Barczewski in Boyd Tartwater. And this was a loose connection, but they did investigate it. They had been charged with the murder of an 8-year-old girl in Colorado. They were young men and they'd been staying with a guy. They ended up having a falling out with the guy they were staying with and ended up killing the daughter with a knife. The reason they had gotten tied to this was Michael Barczewski was from Minnesota and he only lived 5 or 6 blocks away from where the Reker sisters lived. However, the lead died from there because they didn't necessarily know the sisters. They just lived really close. And the case was different circumstances. It wasn't an attack, really. It was more in the moment, had a falling out with somebody rather than an attack like the girls had.
What year was that again?
1978.
78. And was he proven to be in the same, I know he's from there and from that same town, but did the police know for sure that he was in the area in 1974?
No. They just knew that he had lived near the sisters and they had killed another young girl.
Yeah, I don't love that one.
They just feel like they're grasping at straws at this point.
Then you're probably not going to love the next person I talk about either. In the 90s, the family actually had pushed to look at a local reverend who had been accused of sexually abusing children. There was a cabin near Little Falls that the church had owned, and there were allegations that the sexual abuse had happened at this cabin perpetrated by this reverend, and Mary had been to that cabin before. However, there was no evidence that they were actually ever at the cabin at the same time. That reverend was polygraphed and had passed.
Actually,
ahead.
I like that more than this Michael guy. Okay, you could either pass a polygraph or not pass a polygraph, and it means absolutely nothing. Secondly, because we can't prove that she was in the cabin at the same time, also means nothing to me because maybe he covered it up really well, or maybe there just wasn't enough evidence.
She had gone to school in Little Falls, so it's not like she was leaving her parents' house, going to this cabin, and then coming back to her parents' house.
Wait, so the reverend that is connected to the cabin, how far away is it from the parents' house? Is it same town?
No, so this was in Little Falls, which is about 45 minutes north of St. Cloud, but it is the town that Mary had gone to school in.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Because immediately where I got flagged and my eyebrow attempted to raise when you said the pastor came and told the parents that their daughter's body had been recovered. Like, why did the pastor know? And so then when you mentioned the reverend, I was like, it's the church. Was the cops also with the pastor that came to tell, or the cops went and knocked on the pastor's door and said, hey, go tell Fred and Rita that their daughter's body has been found and we're searching for their second daughter? Like, how do you know all this stuff? I'm sorry, I've done a lot of research here lately on too many stories that I've had to cover with church and pastors and Catholics, priests, and I hate saying that out loud, but it is what it is. And so I was like, oh God, we just solved the case. It makes me wonder if this is part, and this is no research as far as this case in grasping at straws, that there's these troubled teen industries and they have so much money and so many kids in and out. And so when you first mentioned the pastor and then now the reverend, and then how she was going away for school at teenage years, I immediately thought, oh, this sounds like the TTI. And there's a shit ton of money with it. And they buy everybody off and then they shut that school down and reopen another one in a different name.
She came home on the weekends, right?
Yeah, most of the weekends, it was told. Who knows what the school districts were like in St. Cloud, and maybe they felt that she would just have a better education at a smaller school where she could get more individualized learning attention.
Maybe, but then was she the only child? There were 6 of them, and she's the only one that's going to school up here, so that's the only kid they care about?
Maybe it was high school only.
I'm thinking back to, okay, I've done a lot of research and a lot of work with people with the troubled teen industry and victims and survivors of that. And so the reason they're named troubled teen is because when we say you're troubled, then any truth that I try to tell you, you've already told me these people that I'm supposed to believe in the church has already told me you're troubled, so I don't believe anything that you say, which is part of that naming of. I think back to her diary. She's not saying who is going to kill her. It's awful. Like Paris Hilton just wrote a book about it and come out because Paris Hilton was sent to the troubled teen industry. If it could happen to Paris Hilton and the Hiltons who are powerful and they can still get away with it, it could happen to anybody like me, just nobody, right? And so if she's labeled to be troubled, if it's the church and these high societal people that she feels threatened by, she's probably too afraid to say their name, which is why she's writing in the diary. I don't even know if the school she went to was troubled teen, but that's where my brain is going. I'm like, as soon as you said preacher and school and diary, I was like, I've heard this so many times with troubled teen.
Yeah, I hadn't gone there, so that's definitely something I considered.
I tied the diary too. I was right. I was going to throw in my speculation, but you just put it out on Front Street, and 100%. That all makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was one investigator from the case that really never let it go. He did pass away in 1983, and when they were cleaning out his desk, they found a bunch of files from this case, and they also found a pair of gold wire-rimmed glasses with a nearsighted prescription in it. No one will say how these glasses are connected to the case, so we don't know when they found them, where they found them, whose they were. We don't know anything about it. But it was a piece of evidence that he just had stashed in his desk drawer.
Again,
So
back to the crazy police stuff. You don't bag that, you don't take that. We just keep it in our desk for a rainy day.
yeah, it was definitely something weird enough that when they cleaned it out, they were like, ugh.
And how do they know it's connected to these particular cases? Like it's just because he was assigned to these cases?
It was also found with a bunch of files from the Reker sisters' murders. In the pictures, one of the sisters did wear glasses. In my mind, it was probably one of the sisters' glasses, but again, they won't say definitively if it was a killer's glasses or what. I don't know if the daughter who was wearing the glasses even had a nearsighted prescription. They're keeping pretty tight-lipped about that. In years since, both the police and the family believe that the girls, and more likely Mary, were going to meet someone that day. And that's why she was so insistent that she had to go school shopping that day, is she was probably meeting someone. And no one to this day has ever been charged for their murders. St. Cloud's not that big of a town, and people did say they saw the girls going to the quarry, but the tips never matched. The times were different, quarries were different, all sorts of different stories coming in. And I want to go back to the neighbor who was waiting for the girls to come out of the store. He was able to give a description of the car that strange man was driving. Police found that man, and he did have a record of sexual offenses, but he had an alibi and passed a polygraph. That's pretty much all said about him. It's a good old case of the 1970s reporting. So I don't know if it was Herb Notch. They just said, we looked into him, it wasn't him.
So the creepy guy at the store, what was his alibi? Because he was literally at the
Thank you.
store at the same time.
I agree.
With the
Well,
girls, but
as much as I hate to say it, that's where we're at now. No one's ever been arrested, much less convicted of this crime of murdering two sisters. So with that, do we have any questions?
You said that this was on Labor Day.
Labor Day weekend, yes.
Labor Day weekend. So this quarry, I'm assuming like this is a local hotspot where I'm thinking that plus Labor Day, like I'm sure there were parties. If that's the place that people go to hang out, I would think it would be packed.
But mind you,
For
there's not
holiday
just
weekend.
one quarry. There's multiple in the area. St. Cloud is called the Granite City, actually. So they did a lot of like digging, mining. There's a lot of quarries in the area. So this could have potentially just been one that was harder to get to or less fun.
Just still seems super risky.
We talked about a lot of cases and names. So refresh my memory. Everyone else that had been murdered or a victim of, there was some kind of conviction with someone with all of those cases, correct?
Yes. So a little more succinctly, Sue Dukowitz was the victim of Herb Notch and James Wagner. She had been abducted from her family's convenience store, taken to the gravel pit, sexually assaulted, stabbed. She played dead, and she did make it out alive. And Herb Notch was arrested and convicted of that crime, along with James Wagner. But the police really didn't draw a connection to the Reker sisters. Georgianne Dreyer is the one that had met Lloyd Welch in the parking lot of the Zehrs store, and they rode off together. He pulled a knife on her and assaulted her by the river, to which she later got the Google alert about.
But he wasn't convicted for her crime, but was ultimately convicted
For
regardless.
the Lyons sisters. Correct.
So we have Georgia, and then we have the Lyon sisters.
Yeah, that's perpetrated by the same man, Lloyd Welch.
And both of those are with Lloyd.
And then there's Michael Barchetsky and Boyd Tartwater, who were convicted of killing the 8-year-old girl in Colorado. And then there was the Reverend. I don't have a name. And I can't even tell if he was convicted of his crimes.
How many
Sue?
times was she stabbed? Yeah, Sue.
Sue Jukowitz.
Or did they ever say how many times she was stabbed?
Not how many times, no. They pulled her out of the car. They started stabbing her, and she determined that the best course of action to save her life was to play dead.
Okay, because when we think of Mary and Susie, like 6 and 13 times, that's a lot. When we think of a stabbing, most of the time when you're in a stabbing case is like out of rage or passion, like whatever, that's a lot of times. Like, why would you need to?
That kind of makes it more personal.
Yeah, it's always personal. Yeah, it's really bothering me.
Like what was throwing me off with it is, and disrespectfully, but I would feel with Mary being the older teenage girl and Susie being the tag along, but Susie being the younger tag along was stabbed
More
times than Mary. And so I kept thinking in my mind, I was like, Mary would be the one, if it was a boy or someone that liked Mary or there was a connection, she would be the one that would have the most aggression toward, I would think, right? And with that passion crime. But then you have this 12-year-old girl who would seem to be an easier target that was double the impact.
unless
So-
she was the target.
Or if she really just got in the way, right?
Yeah.
They really want to sexually assault this girl and you're just pissing me off because you're constantly popping up and getting in the way. So now I'm rage stabbing you.
Into it with the mindset of Mary, the 15-year-old, going out to meet a boy or something.
Mhm.
That boy, but Missy just said what I didn't think of is if it was a random person that just seen them out and he liked Susie the 12-year-old, if that was his demographic, and I wasn't even thinking about that. It's a good point.
Dana,
Well, and
remind me which girl was unclothed?
Mary.
Mary.
The older one.
And she was also the one that was found underwater.
And those are two of the factors too that led me into it was Mary being the target per se.
I wonder if that had something to do with the number of stab wounds. Maybe she rolled or fell or whatever into the water. And so that's why she was, I hate to say only stabbed 6 times, but
Maybe as an act of trying to get away. She was strong enough to get away, but it was just the edge of the cliff kind of thing. And that's why they didn't have the opportunity to do it as many times.
yeah.
And in both cases of Herb Notch and Lloyd Welch, Lloyd took Georgianne to a river near a body of water, and Herb Notch took Sue Jukowitz to a gravel pit. So, like the mining quarry, I can definitely see like they're not that different, and the gravel pit was less than 3 miles away from the quarry where the girls were found.
But okay, so we're in an era where serial killing was popular is the wrong word, but common, I should say. So I bring up Ted Bundy a lot, but there were many others like him during this time. That's number one. Number two, I'm all about connecting the dots and conspiracy theory and all of that. But also, I think we have to remember knives were probably the weapon of choice at this time, or the thing that was easiest to get. Guns weren't as readily available. And so I want to tie all these people together because they were all stabbed. And yes, I asked the questions, but then as I think about it more, I'm like, that was just the easier means to kill. Similar to in today's world, we don't tie every gun shooting together, but that's the popular method to kill, right? So I think we have to take those things into consideration when we're trying to connect dots a little bit. Now, the quarries and the bodies of water, sure, that could be another connection, but I don't know.
And to your point with that, Jamie, that is where I disagree because I didn't put the whole gun access thing, I don't know much about weapons. But for example, I live very close to Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge, which is a very wooded area. There's a lot of places to disappear. There's bodies found all the time that are not related to anything else. It's a quick, easy, secluded place to get to do to do the ugly you're out to do and have enough time to maybe at least get away. And they're not connected. Like, I can't do what I'm doing to you at the local outlet mall, but the closest secluded place where screams aren't going to be heard. And if they are, it's just because you're jumping off the quarry into the water. So they're disregarded. Like, that to me seems the place that you would want to take the people if you had access to it.
To the whole dots thing, though, is, to me, it's the Zehrs, the store, because we have one person of interest that worked there and was known to loiter in the parking lot even on his day off.
That's right.
And then the other big person of interest had already lured another teen girl away from that store parking lot.
I do agree with that, Dot. What a question that I do have, though. Someone had said they've seen a strange man in the parking lot at Zell's, right? Two people, but they both said man. That's what the resources are saying, that we know of what they've said is man.
Yes.
If it was one of these kids that is working in the store, and I'm sorry, but if you're a grown person noticing something weird, you would probably refer to this teenager as a kid still, or a young man, or a boy, like something other than, because when they say, and granted, it could just be the resources that you had available to you, but I feel like there would be different words used versus I saw a man. When someone tells me they see a strange man in a parking lot, I think of 40 up. And then at 20 to 30, you might have young guy, but before 20, you're a kid or a young man or a guy. If it was a weird teenager just playing with his knife and hissing at people, I feel like it would be some weird kid.
Actually, I have a teenager, and that sounds like a teenager thing to do. Like,
I don't know if they're saying man is in man or man is in male.
That's what I was going to say, is that's what I hate about it, because you're giving us obviously what the resources say, but I wonder what word or tone was used, because was there a phone call that was like, so there's this young boy, oh, it's a male, okay, we know how police work. I almost feel that would be something that would stick, like those descriptive words that are going to be age-based or gender-based would be what would stick. What I also don't love is that someone inside the store saw the two Reker girls.
Yeah.
Okay, saw the two Reker girls and was like, they saw a man around, and the youngest one saying, I don't want to go with him. I'm sorry, but if you hear that, you go and you stand beside those girls. He says he went to his car and watched and waited to make sure. But when you hear someone say that, you don't leave the store.
Yeah.
do we know if at least Mary knew her, like, personally, or?
From the reports that I had read and listened to, it sounds like they were connected in the sense of a friend's acquaintance's friend's acquaintance.
So more of, of.
Yeah, like they had the same class together, but they didn't even talk to each other in that class. I think now might be a good time that we can get into our speculations.
I might disappoint some listeners, some of my friends here, but I'm not going to go police speculation route tonight. I'm going to go back to something that we talked about earlier, and I'm really on to the family speculation of the reverend. Okay, so there's a reverend who was accused of, from what I understand, sexually abusing children in a cabin that was in Little Falls where Mary was going to school. So there could be a connection there. I will tie into what David said earlier, and I agreed with him 1,000%. She wrote something in her diary where it was, I know this person that's going to kill me. So I don't think it was this happenstance of she met this teen or she had this boyfriend or friend that maybe was going to go the wrong way. To me, that entry where she talked about if I'm ever murdered, please go find my killer. I have a few reasons to fear my life, leads me down the path of if she was sent to a school or sent to this place where she had this person in authority. I am going to go down the person in authority abusing their powers path. This reverend was abusing his authority power, and she, I think, fell victim to that. And where I lead even more into this is she was naked. Susie was not. So that leads me to believe there was some sexual assault happening there. She could have been into the water because she fell over the edge, but she could also went into the water because they were like, oh my gosh, we did this sexual assault thing. We have to put her in the water because then it'll wash the evidence away. So maybe that's why she was put into water. And maybe she was only stabbed 6 times because something happened during the sexual abuse where maybe she passed out or something like that, where they didn't have to do it quite as much or she didn't fight it quite as much. Or maybe she was being silent because they were going to spare her sister's life or something like that. And then the sister went crazy and that's why she was stabbed a lot more. And my brain just keeps going to that. Like, I want to tie everything together, like we talked about earlier, but I'll go back to knives were just a popular weapon of choice. Serial killers were popular at the time. I don't think they're all connected. I really think this boils down to the Reverend and some shit was happening, and she was unfortunately being taken advantage of by somebody in power. And that's where this goes. But I don't think it was necessarily police corruption or they were involved in some sex trafficking ring or something like that, or covering for the priest by any means. Maybe my new stick is abusing power when you're in authority versus police corruption.
I'm all the way on the opposite end of the island, completely on a separate island, actually, than Jamie. I did think that the whole TTI or the troubled teen industry thing made sense with David's too. That all really made sense. Really good theory that I never would have thought of either. I think this was a crime of opportunity for someone. I think they saw 2 young girls at the grocery store or out and about by themselves, and somebody took advantage of that. I was leaning more towards Herb. I was leaning towards him like off and on throughout this, but I'm thinking it could vary, and I hate to say it because I don't think a lot of things are stranger, but this case could definitely be somebody we haven't even talked about. It sounds like there's a lot of creepos in this neighborhood, and who knows, there's probably more creepos that we don't even know about, and it could have just been a crime of opportunity. And if they were murdered where they ended up, I don't know. I think they were probably dumped there, not murdered there. But I'm leaning more toward crime of opportunity, complete stranger is where I'm more at. And I think it was some creeper who either abducted them out of the parking lot or convinced them to go, maybe convinced the older one to go with him or something. And I also think that there could also just be a red herring because, again, she was a teenager. And honestly, I've said this before, but if you're all going to go look through my books, there's a giant journal from like my college years. Dude, that thing's a shit show. If you read it right now, you'd be like, she has issues. Out of context, we don't really know what maybe she was just saying, if I am murdered, maybe she was into true crime. Maybe she was following the local news and there was young girls being murdered or something. I don't know, but I'm just thinking maybe it's a red herring. But I think that's where I'm
We
at.
are an opposite ends because that diary entry is not a red herring to me.
All right.
So I know that I gave a lot of things away with my speculation, and I said that I wasn't going to use the TTI as part of my speculation, but I will take accountability that I'm a liar because the more that we dived into it, and even when Jamie created her island, my extreme speculation is I want to know more about the school, the preacher, the reverend, and those things. It screams TTI to me. I will say that I loved a lot of what Missy said, except for the red herring with the diary. You might hear things on local news, but it's not like it is today. But I also stick firmly with the cries for help. I don't know that would have been seen as maybe as much of a cry for help as it would be today as far as a diary entry, but something about it was just too real to me. I feel bad because the neighbor that was like, I can't sleep, let me help you. I feel bad that I want to be like, oh, your good deed is because you're a guilty murderer. Like, I hate that we now have those thoughts, but something about that just seems weird to me. It could be the fact that I don't know a lot of the story, but that there's something about that sticks out to me. Then there's the connection of the store that sticks out to me. I have this whole puzzle and none of my pieces are going together and I'm pissed. I don't have a finger to point. Damn it.
Yeah, and it's definitely a hard part of this case is there's a lot of puzzle pieces, but they're not even all from the same puzzle.
I have two paths, two very short paths. I also think this journal entry is super weird. If I think about what I was writing, it was nothing even close to anything like that. Could you imagine how much things would have been different if she had added a name? But I also think that's not something you write unless you feel directly targeted. Some major thing had to have happened. And that makes me feel like it was somebody that she knew, and there was an interaction that made her scared for her life. My other path is when you think about Labor Day weekend, Susie said, I don't want to go with that man. To a 12-year-old, 17, 18-year-old could be a man.
And
So with it being Labor Day weekend, I wonder if somebody approached them and was like, hey, I'm having a Labor Day get together at the quarry. It's going to be really cool. Maybe Mary might have said, yeah, that sounds fun. We can come by for a little bit. It's on our way home. And that's when Susie said, I don't want to go. I could see that happening. Just for some reason, the Labor Day weekend theme is sticking with me. And welcome to the end of my path. I told you they were both short. But those are scenarios where I could see them being the start of what escalated to something awful.
I know my speculation's over, but like I just had that thought of what if they did meet a guy and Mary was interested in the guy, but her sisters are already there with her, so they have to go. Then, of course, it's a busy, loud area because everyone's there partying at the quarry where it's going to echo. And maybe Mary and this guy walk away together to go to a place to hook up. And then Susie comes looking for her sister, and things just go sour from there, which would be a crime of opportunity. Maybe the whole intention was not to murder, or maybe he was sexually assaulting Mary, and Susie came around part of the query and saw it, and then now there's witnesses.
Wish we knew where the stab wounds were, because if, let's say, it was going down the way you're saying and he starts killing Mary and Susie's there and she starts running and he's chasing her and then he's pissed off, that's why she's got more stab wounds. Like, he needs her dead. Like, she's the witness.
That might not be the direction you're going to know, but that's what all of a sudden flashed to my mind when you were saying that. What if they truly did, guy and girl walk away together, and maybe it was just going to be a makeout session, but he was taking it too far, which was leading into that sexual assault, which is why she didn't have those clothes on. And then sister is like, where's my sister? Let me go find her. And then all of a sudden you have an attempted rape or whatever happened and a witness, and build up sexual tension, and you lose your mind with it and act out.
I can definitely see how if Mary was that insistent that she had to go get school supplies that day right then, because she could have been meeting someone. Did Susie invite herself, and she's thinking like, I can't say no, she can't come with me. That's going to raise more questions than if I just let her tag along. But also then to me, it doesn't scream that she was purposefully going to maybe hook up with somebody, because if I have to bring my sister along with me, I don't want her to come with me so I can go hook up with this guy. I'd rather just say, forget it. So maybe she was just going because it was the day before school started and she was going to be leaving for a while. And the weekends when she'd come home, she's busy with family stuff. So she just wanted to go hang out with someone, probably a guy, I'm thinking. I do think it's interesting that they didn't just go to the Zayres store, they also went to Shopko. If it was strictly to get school supplies and a jacket, why did you go to multiple stores? Or did you go to Shopko for the school supplies and then the Zayres for the jacket? There's unfortunately just not a lot about the timeline. They estimated that the sisters were at Zayres from 1 to 2:30, but they left the house at 11. So what were they doing in those 2 hours? Were they at the Shopko? Did they go to other stores? Did they go get lunch with some boy? And then he said, let's go to the quarries to go swim or rock climb. I don't know. Logistically, you have to come home with your winter jacket and more pencils or pens or whatever. Because if you come home with nothing, mom's going to be like, what the hell were you doing that whole time? So were they planning on hanging out with this person and then going to get the stuff so then they could just carry it home? Because I know I wouldn't want to go get the school supplies first, carry it around with me all day. Do I think that it could have been Herb Notch? I don't think it's totally out of the question. I don't really think it's Lloyd, the traveling carnival worker. My gut just doesn't quite want to go with him. The reason why I wanted to present this case is because it does make you go, but he did abduct 2 young sisters from a shopping center, and they've never been found. So that's the problem about this case, is there are a lot of dots and there's a lot of connections. Unfortunately, we just don't have enough string to connect to these dots. Or if they're just random dots, who knows? But the one thing I haven't mentioned is that Rita has worked with some nonprofit organizations that, if invited, will help law enforcement. And the St. Cloud Police Department did allow this nonprofit to work with them, the VDOC Society. They did say that the police department was on the right track. I don't know what that means, because we've had a lot of persons of interest and no one's ever been arrested or convicted. I don't know if they think it was Herb, and since he's since passed away, could they even say, we thought it was him, but he's dead now. But their case is still a cold case. If you do have any information about Mary and Susie Reker's murder, please do feel free to reach out to Stearns County Sheriff. That number is 320-251-4240, or the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension Cold Case Unit at 651-793-7000. Unfortunately, with this case, really all we're left to do is speculate wildly.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to our show today. We ask you to please subscribe to us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else that you find your favorite podcasts, just so you don't miss out on any of our episodes. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at SWACPod, SWACPOD, or you can contact us via email for questions, comments, or case ideas. Our email address is swacpod@gmail.com. That's SWACPOD@gmail.com. Thanks so much for speculating wildly with us tonight.